The forest was ancient, its trees towering like silent sentinels. Leaves whispered secrets to the wind as branches creaked under unseen forces. To most, it was a place of natural beauty. To Emma and her friends, it was a weekend getaway. They planned this trip for months, 5 friends escaping the chaos of the city to reconnect with nature. Emma, the cautious one, had packed extra supplies, flashlights, batteries, a detailed map of the area. Her boyfriend, Jack, teased her for being overly prepared. "It's just a forest," he'd said. What could go wrong? By the time they reached the trailhead, the late afternoon sun bathed the woods in golden light. Their laughter echoed as they ventured deeper into the forest. Emma's best friend, Lila, was snapping photos of everything, while Nate and Rachel, the adventurous duo, took the lead, their energetic pace leaving the others struggling to keep up. It was nearly dusk when they reached a clearing and decided to set up camp. They built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and swapped ghost stories. The mood was light, even when Nate told a particularly chilling tale about a lost hiker who was said to haunt the woods. "They say he whispers your name at night," Nate said, lowering his voice dramatically. "If you hear it, you're already lost." Lila rolled her eyes. "Come on, Nate. You're not scaring anyone." But as the night deepened, the forest grew eerily quiet. The usual symphony of nocturnal animals was absent, leaving only the crackle of the fire and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced around, her eyes searching the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing. Still, unease crept into her chest like a rising tide. "Let's get some sleep," Jack suggested, sensing her discomfort. They retreated to their tents, the fire's glow fading as they zipped themselves inside. Emma awoke to the sound of whispers. At first, she thought it was Jack mumbling in his sleep, but the voice was too faint, too distant. It was coming from outside. She held her breath, listening. The voice called her name, Emma. Her heart pounded. She nudged Jack awake. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. He groaned, half asleep. "It's probably Nate messing with us." But Emma wasn't so sure. Gathering her courage, she unzipped the tent and peered outside. The forest was bathed in pale moonlight, casting long shadows across the ground. She stepped out, the cool air prickling her skin. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost playful. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the clearing. Against her better judgment, she followed it. The forest felt different at night, the trees looming larger, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers. Emma's flashlight flickered, casting wavering beams of light. The whisper grew louder, drawing her deeper into the woods. She stopped abruptly. The clearing was ahead, but something was wrong. The air felt heavy, oppressive. And there, in the center of the clearing, stood a figure. It was a man, his back turned to her. He wore a torn flannel shirt and mud-caked boots. Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. Then, slowly, he turned. His face was pale, his eyes hollow pits of darkness. His lips moved, but the whisper Emma heard wasn't coming from him. It was all around her, echoing through the trees. She stumbled back, her flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the ground. The figure began to move toward her, its steps unnaturally slow, as if wading through water. Emma turned and ran, her pulse pounding in her ears. Branches tore at her clothes as she crashed through the underbrush, desperate to find her way back to the campsite. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent. "Emma, don't run." When she finally burst into the clearing where their tents were, she was gasping for breath. The fire was out, the tents collapsed as if hastily abandoned. "Jack," she called. "Lila? Nate? Rachel?" Silence. Then, from the shadows, a voice. "Emma." She spun around, her eyes wide with terror. The figure from the clearing was standing at the edge of the campsite, its hollow eyes fixed on her. But now there were more. Figures emerging from the trees, their faces blank, their whispers a cacophony that drowned out her thoughts. Emma backed away, her foot catching on a root. She fell hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. As she scrambled to her feet, she realized the figures were circling her, their movements slow but deliberate. The whispers were deafening now, wrapping around her like a suffocating fog. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. The figures were gone. The campsite was intact. The fire crackled cheerfully, as if nothing had happened. Her friends emerged from their tents, yawning and stretching. "You okay, Emma?" Jack asked, concern etched on his face. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She glanced around, her heart racing. Everything was normal, yet she knew it wasn't. Far off in the woods, just beyond the reach of the firelight, the whispers began again. The wind howled outside, rattling the rusted metal windows of the abandoned hospital. Inside, all was eerily silent, save for the soft creaking of the building itself. The hospital, long closed to the public, had become nothing more than a decaying shell of its former self. Yet, for some, it held a strange pull, a dark allure that promised answers to the unanswered questions of the past. Dylan had always been fascinated by abandoned places. As an urban explorer, he had ventured into countless derelict buildings, but there was something particularly unsettling about the abandoned hospital. It stood on the edge of town, forgotten by most, but for those who remembered, it was known as a place where the past's darkest secrets had been buried. Stories of strange experiments, vanished patients, and whispers of an unspoken horror had swirled around the place for decades. On a cold autumn evening, Dylan and his friend Zoe decided to make one last trip into the hospital. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and a thirst for discovery, they made their way through the broken gate that separated the hospital from the world outside. The atmosphere was thick with an eerie sense of anticipation, and every step they took seemed to echo through the empty grounds. The doors creaked open, groaning as though they hadn't been touched in years. The hospital's interior was just as they had expected, dusty, decaying, and suffocating in its silence. The air was thick with mildew, and the faint smell of something far more sinister seemed to linger beneath the decay. "We should be careful," Zoe muttered, her voice barely a whisper as she adjusted the beam of her flashlight. "This place has a history. We don't know what we're walking into." Dylan nodded, but his excitement was palpable. He had heard the rumors too, the ones about strange noises in the middle of the night, flickering lights, and shadowy figures in the hallways. He hadn't believed any of it, of course, but the idea of uncovering the truth was irresistible. The hospital was vast, with endless hallways stretching in every direction. Each door they passed seemed to lead to an even darker, more neglected part of the building. The floors were cracked, the walls peeling, and the ceilings sagging with years of neglect. It was as though the hospital itself had given up, resigning itself to the slow, inevitable decay. They wandered deeper into the bowels of the hospital, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the dark like knives. The further they went, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing colder with every step. Suddenly, they stopped. From somewhere deep within the hospital, they heard it, a faint sound, almost like a whisper, barely audible over the sound of their breathing. It was coming from down the hall, from one of the many darkened doorways that lined the corridor. "Did you hear that?" Zoe asked, her voice tight with fear. Dylan held his breath, listening intently. The whispering grew louder, closer, and then it stopped. "I think we should leave," Zoe said, stepping backward toward the exit. But Dylan didn't move. Instead, he slowly approached the door where the sound had come from. The handle was cold beneath his fingers, and he hesitated before pushing it open. What they found inside the room was a strange, unsettling sight, an old, rusted hospital bed sitting in the center of the room. Strips of white cloth were torn and stained, and there was a faint, lingering odor of something sickly sweet in the air. It didn't take long for them to realize the room had been used for something far more sinister than medical treatment. Before they could leave, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Panic set in as the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was waiting just beyond the door. Dylan tried to turn the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The room was growing colder by the second, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if something unseen was closing in on them. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging them into total darkness. In the silence, Dylan heard something that made his blood run cold, the sound of labored breathing, close, too close. "What the hell is that?" Zoe gasped, her voice shaking. Before Dylan could respond, the door to the room burst open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the faint light from the hallway. It was tall, thin, and impossibly pale, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into their souls. The figure didn't speak, but it didn't need to. It reached out a long, skeletal hand toward them, and as it did, the whispers intensified, filling the air with a maddening cacophony. Dylan and Zoe stumbled backward, their hearts racing as they collided with the cold, unforgiving walls of the room. In that moment, Dylan realized the truth. The hospital hadn't been abandoned at all. It was a prison, a place where the past's darkest sins had been trapped for eternity. And now, it seemed that those sins were coming back to claim their next victims. As the figure advanced toward them, the room seemed to close in, the walls tightening with every step. The air grew thick with despair, and in the darkness, Dylan and Zoe realized they were no longer alone. The whispers, the breathing, the figure in the doorway, they were all part of something far greater, something that had never truly left the hospital's decaying halls. And as the figure reached out to touch them, the world around them went black. It was late. The office building was nearly empty, save for a few late-night workers hunched over their desks, their tired eyes glued to their monitors. Lila, having just finished her shift at the firm, was ready to head home. She checked the time, almost midnight. The elevator's cold, metallic doors loomed ahead, the only way down to the parking garage below. She had been here countless times, walking past the same sterile hallways, taking the same elevator ride. Nothing unusual. The hum of the lights, the faint smell of cleaning supplies in the air, and the echoing click of her heels on the polished floor as she approached the elevator were all part of the routine. She pressed the down button, waiting for the elevator to arrive. It was empty when the doors opened, which was to be expected at this hour. She stepped in, pressing the button for the garage level. The doors slid shut with a soft thud, and the elevator began its descent. But this time was different. The elevator made a strange lurch, followed by an odd, high-pitched sound. Lila frowned, pressing the emergency button as the lights flickered. The smooth ride she had expected suddenly became a jolting stop. The elevator was suspended somewhere between the upper floors and the garage. Her heart raced as the silence that followed felt almost deafening. She glanced at the panel. There was no response from the call button or the emergency phone. Lila took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. "It's just a glitch," she muttered under her breath, though she wasn't sure if she believed herself. Her palms were sweaty, and her mind raced with thoughts of what could be wrong. She looked up at the flickering light and noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection of the elevator's polished walls, she could see another figure standing behind her. At first, she thought it was her imagination playing tricks on her, but when she turned around, the air in her chest tightened. There was no one behind her. Her pulse quickened, and she spun back around, only to see the reflection still standing there, perfectly still. The figure, a man, was tall and unremarkable in appearance. His hair was unkempt, his clothes nondescript, a dark jacket and pants. But there was something unsettling about his presence. His face was blank, expressionless, as if he were nothing more than a hollow shell. Lila backed away slowly, her breath quickening. Her mind was a flurry of confusion. Was this some kind of prank? Had someone gotten in the elevator before her and was now hiding in the corner? "Hello," she called out, her voice wavering, but no one responded. The elevator remained still, the air thick with tension. She reached for the emergency phone again, but her fingers froze as she glanced at the reflection. The figure was closer now, his eyes locked onto hers in the mirror. Lila's heart pounded in her chest. She felt an overwhelming sense of dread. There was no way someone could have moved that quickly without her noticing. It wasn't possible. Desperate, she hit the emergency button again, but this time, the elevator jolted violently, throwing her off balance. She slammed into the wall, her head spinning. When she looked up, the figure was gone. The elevator resumed its descent with a faint hum, but the sense of unease lingered in the air. Lila gripped the rail, trying to steady herself, her body trembling. The doors finally opened with a soft chime, and she stumbled out into the dimly lit garage. Her car was just a few spaces away. She could see it parked under a flickering light, the only source of illumination in the empty lot. But as she took a few steps toward it, she stopped dead in her tracks. A figure stood in front of her, blocking her way. The same man she had seen in the elevator reflection. How did you get here?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The man didn't speak, but his presence was suffocating. His eyes were hollow, empty, and his lips remained in a thin, emotionless line. Lila's mind raced. She tried to back away, but her legs refused to move. It was as if her body was frozen in place. The man took a slow step toward her, his face still unreadable. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. Suddenly, the man's expression flickered. A faint smile twisted his lips, a grin so wide it stretched unnaturally. Lila's breath hitched in her throat as the smile grew, the edges of his mouth curling into something grotesque, something that felt wrong, inhuman. She tried to turn and run, but it was too late. The world around her seemed to collapse in on itself, the shadows deepening, the lights flickering out. She felt a cold hand grip her arm, pulling her back toward the elevator shaft. "You weren't alone," a whisper echoed through her mind, a voice that wasn't hers, and yet, it felt like it had always been there. The man's form dissolved into the shadows, his smile lingering long after he disappeared. The elevator doors opened once more, and Lila was pulled back inside. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the reflection of herself in the polished elevator walls. But this time, she wasn't alone. It was a crisp autumn evening when Sarah and her friends decided to escape the city for a weekend getaway at a secluded lake cabin in the middle of the woods. They had heard stories about the lake, a serene body of water surrounded by towering trees, known for its stunning views and peace. But there were also whispers, stories of strange happenings at night, tales that the locals kept to themselves. These were the kinds of stories Sarah didn't fully believe in until that weekend. The cabin was a rustic, two-story structure with a large wraparound porch. It sat right by the lake, the water stretching out before them, still and glassy under the moonlight. As Sarah and her friends unloaded their bags and set up, the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The kind of quiet that filled the space felt almost unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. As nightfall approached, the group gathered around a crackling fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. The distant sound of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl filled the air. But amidst the familiar sounds of the wilderness, there was something else, a faint, almost inaudible noise that seemed to rise from the lake. "Do you hear that?" Mark, one of Sarah's friends, asked, his voice low. Sarah paused, listening. At first, it was almost too quiet to notice. Then, a sharp scream cut through the stillness, echoing across the water. The group froze, their eyes wide. That's not normal, right?" Emma, another friend, said, her voice trembling. The scream was haunting, full of terror, as if someone was drowning, pleading for help. The sound reverberated across the lake, carried by the wind, before it vanished just as quickly as it had come. "That's not funny," Sarah said, trying to sound confident, but even she couldn't shake the sense of unease that settled in her chest. They waited for a moment, expecting to hear it again, but there was nothing. The night returned to its eerie silence. "I think it came from the other side of the lake," Mark said, his tone almost dismissive. "Probably just some animal." But Sarah wasn't convinced. The scream had sounded too human, too desperate. It was as though someone was in real distress. She glanced at the lake again, the water shimmering under the pale light of the moon, its surface smooth like glass. Later that night, as they sat inside the cabin, the fire crackling in the hearth, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. There was something in the air, a heaviness that seemed to press in on them. The cabin, once warm and inviting, felt cold and oppressive. The faint sound of scraping against the wood, like nails dragging along the walls, sent shivers down her spine. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely above a breath. The others looked at her, their faces pale. "Something's not right," she said, standing up from the couch. She walked toward the window, peering out into the darkness. There, at the edge of the lake, she saw it, something moving, a shadow that didn't belong. It was as though a figure was standing at the water's edge, staring at the cabin. "Sarah, stop," Emma whispered urgently, pulling her away from the window. "It's probably just your mind playing tricks on you." But Sarah couldn't ignore it. The figure was real. She had seen it with her own eyes, and the feeling of dread that washed over her confirmed it. The air had turned colder, and the lake, once so calm, now seemed to shift with an ominous energy. The scream returned then, louder and closer than before. It wasn't a cry for help anymore, it was a wail of pure agony, a sound so chilling that it made Sarah's blood run cold. The others heard it too, this time, and they all stood in stunned silence, their faces drawn with fear. They decided to investigate, though none of them were eager to do so. With trembling hands, Sarah grabbed a flashlight, and the group stepped out into the night. The moonlight cast long shadows over the forest, and the trees seemed to close in around them as they made their way toward the lake. The screams grew louder as they approached, now unmistakably human and filled with terror. Sarah's heart raced, her feet reluctant to take another step. But she couldn't turn back now, not with the sound so close. When they reached the shore, they saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the water, waist deep, staring at them with hollow, empty eyes. Its skin was pale, almost ghostly, and its hair flowed around it like a curtain of black, drifting with the ripples in the water. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, watching them with an unblinking stare, its lips parted as though it was trying to speak. The faintest whisper of words escaped from its mouth, but the wind carried it away before Sarah could hear. Terrified, Sarah backed away, but as she did, she noticed something strange. There were hundreds of other figures in the water, all identical, standing as still as the first, their eyes fixed on her with the same haunting emptiness. Without a word, Sarah and her friends ran back to the cabin, slamming the door shut behind them. They didn't speak as they huddled together in the dim light, still shaken by the sight of the figures on the lake. "What were they?" Mark finally asked, his voice hoarse. "I don't know," Sarah whispered, her mind racing. "But I don't think they're alive." As the night wore on, the group tried to sleep, but the haunting wails continued, drifting across the lake, echoing in their minds. The figures had vanished, but the terror they brought with them remained. By morning, the lake was once again calm, the water still and lifeless. The sky was a bright blue, the air crisp and clean. The events of the night before felt like a nightmare, but the dread in Sarah's chest told her it was anything but. As they packed their things to leave, Sarah caught one final glance at the lake. For a moment, she thought she saw a figure standing at the edge of the water, watching her. But when she blinked, it was gone. The haunting screams by the lake, the figures in the water, they were not something she would ever forget. And as they drove away, Sarah knew one thing for certain: some places, no matter how beautiful, were never meant to be visited. Some stories were best left untold, and some lakes, best left undisturbed. It was a quiet, uneventful evening when Rachel first noticed the shadows. She had just moved into the small suburban house on Elm Street. The neighborhood was peaceful, with rows of well-kept homes, friendly faces, and the occasional sound of a lawnmower or children playing. It seemed like the ideal place to start anew after her messy divorce. Rachel's house was modest, but it had charm. It had a spacious living room with large windows that looked out onto the quiet street. From her vantage point, she could see the house next door, an old Victorian-style home that had stood vacant for years. The windows were dark, covered with heavy curtains, and the overgrown garden added to its eerie appearance. The house had always intrigued Rachel, but she never thought much about it until one fateful evening. It was around 9 p.m. when she first saw it. Rachel was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, when she noticed a shadow moving in the neighbor's window. At first, she assumed it was the flicker of a tree branch in the wind, but when she looked again, the shadow remained. It wasn't just a fleeting movement, it was deliberate, slow, almost as if someone were watching her. The shadow grew larger, stretching across the window like a dark figure. Rachel's heart began to race. She stared at the window, feeling an odd sense of dread creeping up her spine. Was it a person? Or was it just her imagination playing tricks on her? The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Rachel exhaled, trying to calm herself, convincing herself that it was nothing, just a figment of her tired mind. She turned off the TV and decided to go to bed, but as she lay in the darkness of her bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Over the next few days, Rachel couldn't ignore the eerie sense of being watched. Every time she passed the neighbor's house, she would glance at the window, half expecting to see the shadow again. But for days, there was nothing, just the empty, silent house across the street. That was, until Friday evening. Rachel was in the kitchen, preparing a late dinner, when she heard it. A faint tapping against the window. At first, she thought it was just a bird or something falling from a tree, but the tapping continued, rhythmic, deliberate. With a sense of dread rising in her chest, she slowly turned to face the window. There, in the neighbor's window, stood a figure. The figure was cloaked in shadows, with its face obscured, its features indistinguishable. It stood still, motionless, staring directly at her. Rachel's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing. She couldn't move, couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure. Then, without warning, the figure slowly raised its hand and pressed it against the glass, leaving a dark, wet mark. Rachel recoiled, her pulse pounding in her ears. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The figure's hand stayed pressed against the window, as though it were reaching out to her. The doorbell rang, breaking the terrifying silence. Rachel nearly jumped out of her skin. She rushed to the door, trying to shake off the overwhelming fear, and opened it to find her neighbor, Mrs. Henley, standing on the doorstep. "Hi, dear," Mrs. Henley said with a warm smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you, but I just wanted to introduce myself. I've noticed you've been moving in and thought I'd bring over some cookies." Rachel forced a smile, still shaken from the sight she had just witnessed. "Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you." Mrs. Henley seemed to notice Rachel's unease, her smile faltering for a moment. "Is everything okay? You look a bit pale." Rachel nodded, though she didn't feel okay. She glanced at the neighbor's house, the shadowy figure still haunting her thoughts. "I'm just tired. Thank you for the cookies." As Mrs. Henley left, Rachel's mind was racing. She hadn't heard any strange sounds when she opened the door, but what had she just seen in the window? Was she losing her mind? Later that night, Rachel found it impossible to sleep. She kept hearing strange noises from outside, whispers, soft scratching sounds that seemed to come from the direction of the neighbor's house. She tried to ignore it, burying her head under the covers, but it felt like someone was there, waiting, watching her every move. The next day, Rachel decided to visit Mrs. Henley. She couldn't get the image of the shadow out of her mind, and she needed to know more about the old house. When she knocked on Mrs. Henley's door, the older woman greeted her warmly. "Is everything all right, dear?" Mrs. Henley asked, concern in her voice. "I was wondering about the house next door," Rachel said, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's been vacant for years, right?" Mrs. Henley's face darkened for a moment, a flicker of something unspoken passing over her expression. "Yes," she replied carefully. "It's been empty for a long time. No one's lived there in decades." "Do you know who used to live there?" Rachel pressed, her curiosity getting the better of her. Mrs. Henley hesitated, glancing toward the old house. "It's a sad story," she said quietly. "The last family that lived there, they disappeared. Just vanished, without a trace. No one really knows what happened to them, but people say the house is haunted. People claim to see strange things in the windows, hear noises at night, but I wouldn't worry about it." Rachel shuddered, her blood running cold. The shadow in the window, could it be connected to the family that had disappeared? But how? And why was it haunting her? Later that night, as Rachel sat in her living room, she noticed something new. the neighbor's house was no longer empty. A dim light flickered from one of the windows, and the figure, still cloaked in shadows, was there again, standing still, watching. But this time, it wasn't alone. From the corner of the window, Rachel could see movement. More figures, more shadows, slowly filling the space. They were waiting just like before, but now, there were many of them. Rachel's blood ran cold as the realization hit her. The shadows weren't just a figment of her imagination. They were real. And they had been watching her all along. As the figures in the window began to move, one by one, they slowly turned their heads toward her, their faces still hidden in darkness. Rachel tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was trapped, caught in the gaze of the shadows that had followed her from the moment she stepped into the house on Elm Street. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The window was dark again, the house silent. But Rachel knew whatever had been lurking in that house, whatever had been watching her, was still there. Waiting. And it wouldn't stop until it had her too.